Much. Welcome to this HoPIN webinar. This is the first one this year, obviously, and we have two speakers lined up giving very different talks. I think it indicates the range of interest that we have in HoPIN, that people have interest in such a broad range of printed images of all kinds in all countries at all periods. It's extremely broad. So these two are very different talks, but I'm sure you're going to enjoy them, and I'll be interested, as always, in the discussion at the end to see how the two kind of fit together, if at all. We'll wait and see if they do, and if we get questions that go across both talks, which usually happens amazingly. So we have two speakers. They're going to speak for about half an hour each, and then we'll have half an hour for discussion at the end of both, when they've both spoken. So our first speaker is my former colleague from Birmingham City University, Sue May. Sue is an art and design historian, and she has a very interdisciplinary approach. She explores the interface between theology, local, national and international politics, and she focuses mainly on the visual culture of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. She's published detailed analyses of paintings, sculpture and architecture in Italian cities, and she's going to talk to us today. She has an intriguing title, Political Spin in a Mantuan Altarpiece, the image of St. George in Mantegna's Madonna, della Vittoria, and a Hungarian woodcut print, ? And I suspect the question mark is quite key. So over to you, Sue, and tell us all about it. Thank you.
Laura, could we have the slides on, please? Thank you. And the next one, please. Great, thanks very much indeed. I hope everybody can hear me okay, and I hope if you can't, Laura, you'll manage to alert me to any problems. Thank you to John, to the History of the Printed Image Research Group, to Print Networks, and to the University of Wolverhampton for the opportunity to present this research. It's work that I was doing mainly in 2017, since when it's been on a back burner for reasons mostly of care responsibilities, but I'm very happy to be able to return to it. John, you commented on the question mark. You've noticed, therefore, that the title has a question mark at the end of it. While my specialism is the history of art and design of the Renaissance, I'm not an expert on the artist Mantegna in particular, nor on the Gonzaga family for whom the painting was made. But I think I've noticed something interesting, and I'd value hearing your response to my musings. With reference to picture credits, I'd just like to acknowledge Scala Archives for provision of the altarpiece image, and Alinari Archives for the Venice Accademia St. George that I mentioned later on. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. Andrea Mantegna's altarpiece, the Madonna della Vittoria, today hangs in the long gallery of the Louvre, where anecdotally, and here framed in red, visitors are encouraged to hurry quickly past it on their way to see the Mona Lisa. Next slide, please. The altarpiece was completed in Mantua in 1496 for Francesco II Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, the context of which requires some explanation. Mantua was a small independent state lying in the north of the Italian peninsula. As Marquis, Francesco Gonzaga was its ruler. The altarpiece was painted to give thanks to the Virgin Mary for delivering Gonzaga, allegedly victorious, from the Battle of Fornovo, fought in the Taro Valley near to Parma to the southwest of Mantua. Now, a word of warning, I'm going to be talking about two separate battles in this short talk. The Battle of Fornovo is the one directly related to this altarpiece. And then I'll refer later on in the paper to a different battle with different personnel in a quest to unpick an iconographical conundrum. Next slide, please. The Marquis was by profession a condottiere, that is to say, a mercenary soldier, a soldier who was hired and paid to fight a particular cause. The historical context is that from 1494, King Charles VIII of France began leading his French troops south through the Italian states, all the way down to the Kingdom of Naples, in order to, in Charles's terms, reclaim Naples back into Angevin or Anjou sovereignty. In February 1495, Charles was victorious in taking Naples for the French. March 1495 saw the formation of the Holy League of Venice, a political and military alliance between Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Venice, Milan, and the papacy, intending to force Charles out of Naples. As Charles was retracing his steps north to return his army to France, Francesco Gonzaga was appointed by the Holy League to stop him and his troops from getting as far as the French border. The Marquis announced that in the name of God and of St. George, he would depart Mantua to fight against the French. Next slide, please. The Battle of Fornovo, a particularly bloody affair, took place on the 6th of July, 1495. Details after the battle were confused and slow to emerge. Both parties, the French on one side and the Holy League headed by Gonzaga on the other, each claiming victory. Francesco Gonzaga asserted in his own words to have, quote, given birth to the liberation of Italy, end quote. Following which his wife, Isabella d'Este, and the rest of his team at court put in motion a series of multimedia initiatives to publicise and memorialise this purportedly pivotal victory, including medals, poems, frescoes, festivities, and the painting of the Madonna della Vittoria. Gonzaga's self-styled victory was a long-awaited military distinction after 10 years of otherwise unspectacular rule, so the requisite celebrations were made. This before you is an engraving picturing the battle with the French waving their fleur-de-lis crest, visible bottom left, shown to be humiliated in defeat to Gonzaga and the Holy League. Next slide, please. This glorification of Gonzaga's victory included the rapid erection of an edifice to receive the altarpiece on the 12-month anniversary of the battle, the little church seen here today as it appears on Via Fernelli in Mantua. This was deconsecrated following Napoleonic annexation, when the painting found its way to the Louvre, where it remains. Next slide, please. The altarpiece setting is a verdant garden arbour within which the enthroned Virgin extends her protective right hand down towards the kneeling Marquis, Francesco Gonzaga, at bottom left. The assembled saints comprise, opposite the Marquis, the elderly St. Elizabeth and the infant St. John the Baptist. At left and right, the two warrior saints, Michael and George, and peeping out from behind them, two saints of particular local significance in Mantua, St. Andrew and Longinus. Now, time doesn't allow us to linger on each, so today we shall focus mainly on St. George, seen to our right. Next slide, please. Apologies for the slightly skewed camera angle of the right-hand image, a close-up of St. George taken in front of the painting in the Louvre. Shown in armour and holding a broken lance, recalling the slaying of the dragon, he and St. Michael opposite are recognised as vanquishers of evil. St. George has the air of the barbarian about him, his long striated hair flowing back into ragged-edged, unkempt wisps. He has a projecting nose, high, bony cheeks, a pointed jawbone and prominent chin. His thin eyebrows sit above small, dark, beady eyes. His particularised facial features are in stark contrast to those of Mantegna's earlier St. George. Next slide, please. Thank you. Mantegna's earlier St. George, now hanging in the Accademia in Venice, who has the abstracted, symmetrical, immaculate beauty of a classical sculpture. And the next slide, please. Thank you. It's acknowledged, of course, that there are at least 30 years between these two paintings. And by 1496, Mantegna had absorbed a large repertoire of visual influences from which he could draw. For its point of departure, this paper revolves around a comparison between Mantegna's 1496 St. George and a particular woodcut print, which I now put before you. Next slide, please. A feasible explanation for the un-Mantegna-esque style of his 1496 St. George may be that it may owe its origin to a source outside of the classical tradition. It bears, I think, some resemblance to an earlier northern woodcut print seen here at the left. I see, although you may disagree, a similarity between these two faces. The hairstyle, the prominent nose and chin, the beady black eyes and the linear eyebrows. The twisted thong of the headband with a bejewelled cluster at the centre is a further similarity, although one to which I shall return with further comment. On the right, St. George's mouth, curiously part open and indistinct at the juncture of the lips at the side of the mouth, even seems to echo the strange mouth of the woodcut's face, surely a slip of the woodcutter's stylus, if I've got the terminology correct. Could it be that Mantegna has based his St. George on the woodcut print, or could both be survivors of a lost common prototype? For a moment, let's explore the former, that Mantegna took a cue from the print, starting with the identity of the figure in the woodcut. Next slide, please. The print shows a representation of Janos Hunyadi, one of many woodcut illustrations contained in János Thuróczy's Chronica Hungarorum, or Chronicle of the Hungarians. Here specifically that from the first edition, printed in Brno in March 1488. Next slide, please. A word about the Chronicle of the Hungarians before I proceed. The author, János Thuróczy, was a Hungarian civil servant who worked at the royal court in Buda, today's Budapest. And his book was the first and most extensive history of Hungary to be written by a layman. It consists of a compilation of earlier historical accounts, both oral and written, while the part of the book recounting Hungary's most recent history, including Janos Hunyadi, was composed by Thuróczy himself. Drawing on diplomatic documents and letters, Thuróczy nonetheless cherry-picked information somewhat and tended, naturally enough, to idealize his Hungarian heroes. From the outset, the illustrated chronicle was intended by the Hungarian king for mass circulation throughout Hungary, and particularly beyond its own borders. Next slide, please. Returning to the particular woodcut in question, the figure pictured was famous for his meteoric rise as a military commander and statesman, ultimately appointed Captain General of Hungary. The woodcut, however, should not be considered a direct portrait as such of Hunyadi. No likeness made during or immediately after his lifetime has survived. This is rather a fanciful representation in late Gothic style, showing the Hungarian commander in full armour, holding a sword in his right hand and a shield in his left. A second edition of the Chronica Hungarorum was printed in Augsburg very shortly afterwards in the same year, 1488, for which new woodcuts were prepared. This second edition also includes a representation of Janos Hunyadi. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide? Oh, thank you, thank you. This second edition also includes a representation of Janos Hunyadi, this time Hunyadi's face hidden behind his visor, closed and ready for action. While Mantegna may have drawn on the first edition for the twisted thong of the headband, he may also have drawn on this second edition for the motif of the single feather rising from the centre of the forehead. However, it's only fair of me to point out that the motif of the headband and rising feather can be seen elsewhere in the iconography of St. George. Next slide, please. For example, most famously, Bentnauticus sculptural group in Stockholm of St. George slaying the dragon on the left shares this attribute of headband, though here with two feathers. Other scattered examples can be found of St. George with a thin headband with and without single or multiple feathers. Next slide, please. Hence, the headband with feather may be incidental to perceiving a connection between these two images, since the iconography of St. George already sometimes includes this motif. Nonetheless, I shall continue to tentatively argue, on the grounds of the facial similarities mentioned earlier, that a connection may exist. Excuse me. I've spoken about Francesco Gonzaga and the Battle of Fornovo. This is the point in the talk when I'm going to begin to make reference to a completely separate battle that took place a few decades earlier. So please mentally park the altarpiece and bear with me whilst I sketch in historical context for an earlier battle involving Janos Hunyadi. Next slide, please. Since the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453, regions adjoining the Ottoman Empire were constantly subject to raids and skirmishes. This map shows the situation in Europe around 1500, the Ottoman Empire at bottom right. As you can see, the Kingdom of Hungary, shown here in mauve, was the next obvious gateway for the Turks to make a move on Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. Next slide, please. In 1454, news arrived that Sultan Mehmet II, seen here with the turban, and his Ottoman army was preparing to conquer Hungary. By April 1456, Mehmet's forces, whose preparations had been made on a gigantic scale, were already moving toward the Danube. The Turks were aware that the mighty, strategically located fortress at Belgrade, capital of today's Serbia, seen here in the engraving, built at the confluence of the rivers Sava and Danube, were combined a serious impediment to their progress. If successfully negotiated, there was no further natural obstacle onwards to Buda or Austria. Hunyadi's preparations against the Turks were repaid with a hard-won victory on the 22nd of July 1456, whereby Hunyadi's army halted the Turkish invasion and saved Hungary for the next 70 years, as well as sparing the Balkans and the rest of Christian Europe. Mehmet, with his enormous flotilla, huge cannon, siege machinery, and tens of thousands of men, suffered an ignominious defeat, reports of which soon reverberated throughout Europe. Although Hunyadi died of the plague 3 weeks after the Turkish defeat, he was still remembered in Italy through the 1480s and 1490s as the saviour of Christendom. During this period, both Hunyadi and his son Matthias or Matthias Corvinus were legendary for their prowess as military commanders and champions of Christendom, reputations reinforced, of course, by the Chronica Hungarorum in 1488. Next slide, please. Hunyadi's son, Matthias Corvinus, who had become King of Hungary in 1458, rose to mythic status in his own right for his military virtuosity and his cultivation of Italian humanism at the Buda court. Indicative of his fame as far afield as Rome, a life-sized fresco of Matthias on horseback in battle against the Turks adorned an exterior wall near to the Campo dei Fiori, the frescoed image now lost, but captured here in a miniature watercolour, and apologies for the very poor quality. Ever since the fall of Constantinople, the Italian states had been and still were agitated and in heightened alarm about an impending Ottoman invasion, and were acutely aware of the role of Hunyadi and Corvinus as defenders of the faith, and the strategic importance of Hungary as a buffer between the Italian peninsula and its Muslim foe. Next slide, please. To begin to draw all of this together, as has already been shown, Mantegna's votive altarpiece came about as the result of a tenuous victory by Francesco Gonzaga at the Battle of Fornovo in 1495. I'm suggesting that St. George in the altarpiece could have been intentionally painted to bear a resemblance to the Hungarian hero Janos Hunyadi, famous for his resounding triumph over the Turks at the Battle of Belgrade in 1456. I propose that this may have been done intentionally in order to draw a parallel between the two purportedly decisive victories and their respective alleged importance on resisting invasion from encroaching enemies, one from the east at Belgrade, the Ottoman Turks, and one from the west at Fornovo, the French. In the Madonna della Vittoria, the other warrior saint, opposite to St. George, is St. Michael, sporting leonine tresses of golden hair. Next slide, please. Pushing my potential hypothesis further, I venture to wonder whether Mantegna's St. Michael might be meant to invoke images of Matthias Corvinus, such as that also represented in the Chronica Hungarorum, seen here right. King Matthias of Hungary cultivated portrayals of himself sporting wavy blonde or rose blonde hair falling down to the shoulders, as a reference to the lion as the personification of kingship. I'm not suggesting that St. Michael's face looks like that in the woodcut, merely that his wavy blonde hair may be indicative of Matthias Corvinus. Next slide, please. Returning to the altarpiece's original home of Santa Maria della Vittoria in Mantua, and specifically to its interior, next slide, please. I show here briefly on the left the interior as it actually is today, divided horizontally by a later wooden truss floor. As you can see, a reproduction of the Madonna della Vittoria altarpiece hangs on the back wall. And on the right, art historian Ugo Bazzotti's reconstruction, digitally reuniting the building into a single space. I'd like to throw into the mix the fact that one of the tondi in the vault, next slide please, features a bust of a little-known Hungarian saint, Eusebius of Esztergom, identified by its inscription. Eusebius, a religious hermit, was founder of the earliest Hungarian order in the hills near to Esztergom on the Danube. Possibly planned by Mantegna as part of the integral decorative programme, this roundel may reinforce the notion of a Hungarian strand within the whole iconographic programme. Next slide, please. If we entertain the idea that Thuróczy's Chronica Hungarorum may have had some contributory influence on the iconography of the altarpiece, it's necessary to consider how the book might have found its way to Mantua. This important volume, the Chronica Hungarorum, which Hungarian scholar Mariana Birnbaum terms a historical and literary monument of 15th century Hungary, was well known in humanist circles. For his part, Francesco Gonzaga, the patron of the painting, was a bibliophile and showed a keen interest in obtaining books from far afield, demonstrating a particular interest in travel literature. Next slide, please. The Gonzaga had well-established Europe-wide connections. The aunt of Isabella d'Este, for example, was Beatrice of Aragon, Queen of Hungary, consort of Matthias Corvinus. As rulers of the small and vulnerable state of Mantua, and needing to keep abreast of diplomatic affairs, the Gonzaga had developed a sophisticated network of resident ambassadors, envoys, and messengers, providing effective lines of communication and routes of cultural exchange. Geographically, Mantua benefited from access to the Adige Valley, an important transalpine route to German-speaking lands and beyond, in constant use by Mantuan cloth merchants and others of all nationalities travelling in either direction. For those from ultramontane parts wishing to travel to Bologna, to Rome, or the overland route to Venice, it was expedient to cross Mantuan territory. Given the high volume of traffic, diplomatic, humanistic, artistic, and commercial crossing over the Alps, printed copies of the Chronica Hungarorum could easily have found their way to Mantua. Next slide, please. As for Mantegna, in his early career, he'd painted a portrait of the Hungarian Neo-Latin poet János Hunyadi, top left, who'd studied in Ferrara and through his witty epigrams was personally well known to the Italian elites. As a consequence of that painting, King Matthias himself had commissioned a portrait from Mantegna, now lost but known through copies, such as that bottom left. He'd painted also Cardinal Trevisan, top right, who'd led and won a military campaign against the Ottoman Turks, assisting Hunyadi at Belgrade. And as court artist, he painted, of course, Cardinal Francesco Gonzaga, a different Francesco Gonzaga, the Marquis's uncle, bottom right, who'd been charged by Pope Pius II with preparing the papal fleet for Pius's intended crusade against the Turks. Through these contacts then, Mantegna had early exposure to Hungarian affairs. Further, following the advice of Leon Battista Alberti, advice to artists to associate with literary men, the artist's access to the Chronica Hungarorum is quite feasible. Mantegna's so-called ingenio, or ingeniousness, was singled out for praise by many of his contemporaries. As Mantegna scholar Keith Christensen pointed out, nothing in Mantegna's art is casual. Next slide, please. I ask you then, please, to comment on my observation of a similarity between Mantegna's St. George and the woodcut print of Janos Hunyadi. Might this be a direct quotation, complete with the uncertainty of the mouth? Or do you think it more likely that both derive from a lost tradition of Hunyadi representation, or a lost common prototype of some other kind? Do you think it conceivable that Mantegna himself might have proactively suggested to Francesco Gonzaga the referencing of the victory at Belgrade through Hunyadi's likeness? Final slide, please. According to Francesco Gonzaga's biographer, Molly Bourne, the artist Mantegna seems to have been privileged with an unusual level of face-to-face contact with the Marquis, for whom he'd been employed as resident court artist for 36 years. I'd like to fancy that during the cold months of 1495 and early 1496, when Gonzaga was home from campaigns and overwintering at Mantua, Mantegna might have suggested this subtle, esoteric message that symbolically elevated the Marquis's marginal victory over the French in 1495, if indeed it was a victory, to one on a par with Hunyadi's famous and unequivocal victory over the Turks in 1456. I humbly invite your responses and look forward to hearing them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Sue. That was extremely interesting. I enjoyed that very much. Yes, if people have thoughts, questions, you can start putting them into the Q&A now. Please don't use the chat for questions. Put them into the Q&A now rather than keep them. We'll deal with them after we've had the second speaker. But thank you, Sue, for getting us off to a great start there. Very interesting hypothesis. I personally think you're onto something, but we'll see what other people think in the Q&A in half an hour or so. So from the 15th century, we fast forward to the 19th century, and Johanna Holmes is going to talk to us about women, Victorian women in printed illustration. Johanna has given a talk on a HoPIN event, at a HoPIN event before, a year ago, almost to the day, but not quite. and she is an independent historian looking at women's commercial engagement with the 19th century workplace, focusing on careers that require technical training, personal agency, and entrepreneurial ingenuity. Her doctoral dissertation was on women's careers in the London art world 1820 to 1860, and has fueled research into women training and working at the intersection of Victorian values and commercial preconceptions. Yeah, Johanna, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. And could I have the opening slide, please? So the motif which I've used to open my talk is a detail from a foolscap-sized certificate printed from wood engravings, which was awarded by the Female School of Art in 1864 to contributors to the unprecedented success of their fundraising campaign in that year. This culminated that summer in a 3-day fete and bazaar held at the Royal Horticultural Halls on Cromwell Road in London, and organised largely by Henry Cole at the South Kensington Schools and Museum, and rivaling the International Exhibition of 1862 in numbers of attendees. The money raised and the royal patronage announced by this event set the Female School of Art on a course of financial security and public status, which lasted for the next 40 years. However, the message of this motif, "Every wise woman buildeth her house," and its imagery of 2 young women constructing a plinth, announces a mission of promoting female self-reliance in defiance of prevailing social expectations of the time. Today, I shall talk about the origins of that defiance and argue that it consolidated into a countercultural mission at the Female School of Art, which, although pursued without fanfare, to say the least, continued with real and increasing results in terms of women's opportunities to turn their art training to paid employment into the 20th century. Next slide, please. The background to this slide shows an image reproduced in the Illustrated London News of 1868 of a class in painting the clothed model at the Female School of Art, which I'll call the FSA from now on. Having researched the earlier history of the FSA, I knew that firstly classes in the 1840s and 1850s had not remotely resembled this picture of elegant and spacious artistic practice, and secondly, that while the FSA had relocated under new management in 1860 from Gower Street to Queen Square, this had not, as some art historians have suggested, severed ties with the Department of Science and Art at South Kensington. Classes at the FSA in Queen Square were still very prevalently those required by the teaching of the elementary modules of the South Kensington method, as had been the case at Gower Street. Images of such classes for girls here at Lambeth in Spitalfields or Manchester would all be similar. I suspect that this image depicted one of the short courses for fee-paying students and was intended to attract more of the same, but was far from being typical. Nevertheless, this image seems to have given generations of subsequent scholars grounds to characterize the FSA's 40-year life as a slow decline from royal patronage and fashionable respectability, as F. Graham Chalmers put it in his most comprehensively researched study of 1998, into financial and artistic collapse, without any great achievements to its name. It seemed improbable to me while I was doing my doctoral research that the headmistress of this school, Louisa Gann, and the teachers Helena Wilson and Laura de la Bellinay had so spectacularly lost focus on the principles of women's training and work opportunity, which infused their own student days and teaching experience in the 1850s. Can we have the next slide, please? In the 1850s, while the FSA was still in Gower Street under the management of the artist Fanny McKeon, the school received not only exceptional financial subsidy from Henry Cole and Richard Redgrave, but endorsement of their competence and talent in comparison with male students. It is difficult to overemphasize, I think, the galvanizing effect on young women of no particular social standing to gain national prizes, public exhibition, and personal public reputation, combined with opportunity to graduate to advanced training, examinations on the same criteria as the men, scholarships and salaries for poorer young women of talent. A generation of independently minded and ambitious young women, whose names form the background to this slide, went on to train at South Kensington, then encountered the glass ceiling of their day. Unlike their male peers, they were not appointed to teaching jobs within the schools of design. Their qualifications and skills lacked credibility in the artistic or craft workplace. The British obsession with gender segregation in the workplace and the publicly idealized role of women at home ensured that they would be obliged to be self-employed. Nevertheless, many cobbled together financially viable working careers lasting over 30 years. More importantly, they maintained a new loose network of mutual support, both practical and political, with a small p, which included members of the developing feminist movement at Langham Place, and particularly those pursuing women's work opportunities through the fledgling Society for the Promotion of Employment for Women, whom I'm afraid I'm going to call SPEW in the talk that follows. This was the context in 1860, when Henry Cole withdrew the exceptional subsidy which the school at Gower Street was receiving, which inspired Louisa Gann, her teaching staff, and many of her students to raise funds to enable the FSA to continue as before, but under new management. Next slide, please. We can see the evidence of this inheritance in the printed ephemera produced for the Grand Fête and Bazaar in 1864, as well as in the lists of subscribers and lady visitors who supported the FSA after it had moved to Queen Square. I referred at the beginning to the Certificate of Thanks with its defiant reinterpretation of a scriptural quotation. Here it is in its setting on the page. I'm also showing you here the ticket in a far coarser, more raucous style of woodcut to one of the events at the fete, depicting Henry Cole, Richard Redgrave, and Lord Brougham as canine presidents of the dog show. Lord Brougham was founder of the National Association for the Promotion of Social Sciences and supporter of Jessie Boucherette's activities to promote female employment through SPEW. Nevertheless, the FSA could not afford to adopt the role of a rebellious breakaway organisation. For reasons of legality and financial credibility, it needed a board of management of reputable and established men. Financial viability and the credibility of its teaching qualifications required that it remain in connection with South Kensington, using the same syllabus and teaching methods as the many schools of art in other locations in London and elsewhere. Financial viability also required charitable donors and fashionable fee-paying students and their parents, who had their own requirements and expectations. Royal patronage, an elegant public image, and the assurance of utmost respectability and artistic delicacy were vital. All of these qualities predominate in the FSA's annual speech days and exhibitions of work over the 30 years to 1890, and form the public face of the organisation as reported in the press. A study of the FSA's annual reports, however, reveals in reports on the school's activities in the year a persistent and determined activism promoting students' working careers as independent women. Next slide, please. In these annual reports, now collected in the archive of Central St Martin's in London, the contrast is extreme between the values and sentiments expressed in the speeches made by the president of the occasion, often a senior representative of the aristocracy, the government, or the art world, and the humble secretary's report, which did not receive a public airing. In the first, The value of art and the female artist are clear, extremely conventional and not a little patronizing to students and teachers alike, like most speech day speeches. The FSA's success is promoted in terms of prizes and awards won in the South Kensington competitions, including those for teachers, in successful entrance to the Royal Academy schools, and in critical acclaim for female painters, some of them alumni of the school. In the second, in the Secretary's reports, the value of hard work and professional ambition is celebrated in records of the growing number of scholarships awarded, work experience completed, and latterly expansion of residential and teaching accommodation. It is not until 1870, though, that there is any mention in the Secretary's report of alumni actually finding work, and it is another 6 years before any of them are personally identified. From then on, however, these reports offer an increasingly vibrant insight into the life of the school and the various byways of art in which students found economic reward and independence. Louisa Gann, headmistress at the FSA over nearly 5 decades, never spoke from the platform at these annual events and does not put her name to the Secretary's report, but her determination, values and priorities permeate them, particularly when read in conjunction with 2 interviews which she gave to magazines for young women in the 1890s, which I will come to in conclusion. Next slide, please. In the 1870s, the FSA annual reports, insofar as they record alumni being successful in finding work, provide a record of female enterprise in finding precarious, self-employed work through contacts rather than any assistance from the FSA beyond training to the level deemed necessary by South Kensington and to be elementary. Largely, the work was in areas of the decorative arts for which women were deemed particularly suited, according to an ideology which had been prevalent from earlier in the century, and probably entailed little original design work. This painting on Minton tiles, for example, which still adorns the Victoria and Albert Cafe wall, was designed by the eminent painter and director of the training school at South Kensington, Sir Edward Poynter RA, but produced by a team of young women poised between student and professional life, the leader of whom, Amy Black, had been a student at the FSA some years previously. Amy subsequently worked as a porcelain painter at Minton's art studio and elsewhere in the ranks of anonymous, highly skilled copyists, none of whom earned a great deal or had a reliable source of income, and among whom it is difficult, if not impossible, to trace individual careers or to find accredited evidence of their work in order to gauge its quality. And this is true of the majority of FSA alumni whose success in gaining work is reported in the annual report over the succeeding years. But in the 1870s, circumstances offered scope for the FSA to become an agent for its students, matching talent with immediate work prospects in applied art. And this active engagement with the employment market laid the foundation for the FSA's subsequent initiatives in print-related employment. Next slide, please. The FSA had, no, we've skipped one. There we are, thank you. The FSA had for some years recommended suitable students to schools or private families seeking art instructors. But in the mid-1870s, a generation of women came to professional maturity in the decorative arts, having received earlier training in the schools of art, either at FSA or elsewhere, and now sought apprentices in order to expand the capacity of their businesses. Elizabeth Collingridge, who combined her own painting career with a business producing decorated furniture, asked for recommendations from FSA of young women who might wish to take on apprenticeships with her. Charlotte Spears and Ethel Welby, porcelain painters and friends from the Minton Art Studio, which was destroyed by fire in 1875, set up in business together after that, capitalizing on the craze for painted porcelain plaques, and requested recommendation for apprenticed assistants. For students who were unable to afford the apprenticeship premium, SPEW offered they could step in with a grant funded by money received from the city and guilds. Most importantly, with their admittedly low pay as apprentices, students could afford to take advanced training in particular decorative art skills while still studying at the evening classes at FSA for further qualification if they wished. Both the FSA and SPEW had close relationships with a number of City of London guilds and with the Institute, but while FSA used their funding for scholarship for study of art and design within the school, SPEW was funding work/training opportunities for young women. These arrangements in the mid-1870s seem to be the first occasion on which FSA participated in offering formal training in drawing and design to women already embarked on earning a living in a particular trade. Both organisations were taking advantage of changing public and government attitudes towards technical or practical training in science and art. By 1880, SPEW had formalised its arrangements for an annual grant from the City and Guilds of London Institute to fund indentures for female apprentices and was supporting female apprentices to small business owners in a wide range of decorative arts. The FSA was supplying recommendations of candidates and training for them in some cases, but also partnering with the emerging technical schools and the Society of Arts to place students with their fees paid in suitable trade settings. The annual report for the year 1877-78 makes two telling observations. There is an indication that some form of dialogue has opened with the Society of Arts concerning the FSA offering careful art training to future students of the anticipated technical schools. Secondly, it is observed that the partnership with a business such as that of Welby and Spears offers talented and well-trained FSA students a route into the structured, purposeful and dependable workload which they need and which a well-managed company can offer, rather than their being left to wander about alone and fail to find appropriate employment. Such sentiments grow in strength and commitment over the next 5 years, culminating in a speech from the floor at the FSA annual meeting in 1883. Sir Philip Cunliffe Owen, who was director of the museum at South Kensington, but also a member of the South Society of Arts, proposed that the FSA might sponsor in 1883 a number of workshops or studios which would enable young women to move into workshops or studios, which would place them in a prime position or kickstart their careers in those particular trades. Next slide, please. Even as Sir Philip was speaking, a chromolithography class was in the first year of operation at the FSA. Under the specialist tuition of Monsieur Faustin, a French émigré renowned for his caricatures, mildly derisive of both French and English establishments, a number of students were training in the technique. Although the annual report on the year's activities awards the credit for the inauguration of this initiative to Sir Philip, it had obviously been in the planning stages for a period beforehand, and we can speculate that his comments at the previous annual meeting concerning the many excellent qualities of Louise Again may indicate the true source of many initiatives and innovations through the 1870s and 1880s. From personal experience, he said, he had felt the power of Miss Gann's persistent persuasiveness and found it the wisest policy to at once consent to her many but always wise suggestions, knowing how futile it would be to endeavour to resist. Over the course of the 1880s, the chromolithography enterprise took on the life of a successful business on a similar model to that of the art studio at Minton's, where Spears and Welby had trained. In 1885, after 3 years' progress, it was put on a permanent and self-supporting basis with its own committee of management and as well as a technical training class, a commercial studio working to commissions. Funds were obtained from the city guilds to support apprentices in the training class who were appointed to jobs in the studio if they acquired the necessary skills as vacancies arose. Over the next decade, the chromolithography studio did indeed become self-supporting, although arriving rather late in the upsurge of colour printing arising from technological developments in chromolithography in the 1860s, then suffering the general decline of the technique towards the end of the 19th century as other technologies became prevalent. Commissions were received from newspapers, including the Illustrated London News and the Graphic, from business and from artists seeking to record or disseminate prints of their works, including several ex-FSA students. Special series of images were initiated and designed, including Birds and Plants after Gustave Léancey, published by his publisher Le Chertier Barbe, and other similarly library table collections. By 1890, the business had extended and initiated an elementary training class for girls of 15 or 16 who were not previously FA students, but who then regularly joined classes at the FSA in conjunction with their technical training. SPEW, which in the early years of the 1880s had backed away from grants to women entering the print-related illustration trades, now provided city and guilds funding for these younger students' fees. Students who completed their training and were not appointed to jobs in the studio secured work in other companies, other cities, and other continents. The image shown on this slide, a New Year's card of the 1880s, is shown here merely to illustrate the prevalence of the technique's application and the results. Unfortunately, I've not yet found any images attributable to the FSA's chromolithography studio, let alone individual practitioners. But turning to the FSA's second major initiative, illustrated on this page, to prepare students for commercial employment, this image shows an example of so-called black and white illustration widely used in newspapers and periodicals and in low-value ephemera from the 1880s onwards. Its message is clear and direct, the style reminiscent of street posters and caricature, and it's a far cry from the studied realism, impressionism, or fantasies of contemporary fine art styles, and from the equally stiff, stylized design exercises of the curriculum in the schools of design. It was a style not taught by the Royal College of Art at South Kensington, probably because it was deemed to lack aesthetic value, but when 3 previous students gave evidence in 1910 to a commission of inquiry, they stated that since leaving the Royal College of Art, most of the paid work which they had sought required these skills, together with an understanding of the reproductive processes which their illustrations would endure. Black and white, however, was, excuse me, I'm just losing my space, and I'm back now, just about. Sorry about that. The trouble of not using paper. Black and white had been taught at the FSA for nearly 20 years before those students gave their evidence on the shortcomings of the Royal College. And students' output in this style was exhibited alongside their more conventional work in the annual school exhibitions. In one of her interviews in the early 1890s, Louisa Gann said that one of her teachers was particularly interested in black and white, and I suspect this to be Florence Reason, then teacher of the evening classes at the school. Appointed in the year of 1885-86, Florence had been a student at the FSA where she won medals and prizes before going on to the RA schools and pursuing a career as an exhibiting painter. She was, however, pragmatically flexible about her own need to earn her living in the byways of art, and combined this with a teaching post at the FSA for 15 years, from 1885 to 1900. As teacher of the evening classes, Her students were those who were expected to be working during the day and thus obliged to study in the evenings. For several decades, the schools of design and their historians were somewhat disparaging about this student body on grounds of their social class and presumed poor education. But the FSA annual report for 1890 relates with pleasure that the evening class is well attended by day students. Over the course of the 1890s, more teachers were appointed to teach the evening classes, while Florence was appointed assistant teacher in the daytime. Her contribution to the FSA annual report for the year 1897 to 98, referring to the Friday class for the study of black and white press illustration, has made good progress. Several students have had their work published, and several previous students, possibly previous, have received many commissions either for illustrations or for posters. Over the course of the 1890s, articles and interviews published by Louisa Gann, the first of her long career, together with the assertion in the FSA annual report for 1895 to 1896 that the primary reason for the existence of the FSA is to afford the necessary instruction to young women desirous of earning their living, suggest a final unveiling of the original objectives from the 1850s and 1860s. Next slide, please. I think it is clear from Louisa Gann's statement here at the beginning that she personally is more invested in the potential professional artists than the amateurs. Although proud of the students whose artistic ambition has taken them to the continent or the USA, and whose work is generally hung in galleries, she does not take credit for their success in the interview from which this quotation comes. The background to this slide lists the many young women who benefited from scholarships at the FSA, which enabled them to continue their studies when economic considerations suggested they should instead get immediately available work. To the extent that the FSA was able to adjust its teaching and early career training to make this economically worthwhile to them in the long run, Gann's original mission was gradually realized over the course of 40 years. Changing public attitudes and investment enabled the FSA to extend and develop its activities in practical ways, gradually embracing commercial rather than aesthetic values. However, the roll call of these scholarship girls and of alumni whose careers are traceable over more than, say, 5 years is very small compared to the total number of students, and minute compared with the ranks of even little-known artists, men and women who trained in art at more prestigious mixed-gender schools and pursued exhibiting careers. Does this make the FSA a second-rate art school, which, as first Henry Cole and then F. Graham Chalmers suggest, deserve to be put out of its misery? Or have I successfully argued that it represents a valiant effort to contribute to the progress of women's economic independence, using institutional and financial mechanisms which were quite unsuited to the purpose and in a generally hostile world? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna. That was extremely interesting, and I think the audience will agree that we've had two very interesting and very competently presented talks there, very much as our title indicates, contrasts in print. So we now have questions and answers. I have a few questions. I have a few questions coming up in the Q&A box. Please put your questions in there. Can I just mention before I start putting questions to the speakers, if you're not a member of HoPIN already and would like to join, I will put my email address in the chat in the next minute or two, and you can email me if you would like to join HoPIN. It costs absolutely nothing, and you get some wonderful presentation. You get to know what's coming next as well, which is quite useful. Right, I'll take these roughly in order, except that I want to try and balance them between the two speakers. So First of all, a question for Sue from Henrietta Lockhart. Gonzaga and St. George appear to be meeting eye to eye across the picture, which would support your idea. Gonzaga is not looking up at the Virgin, but rather across at St. George, who is gazing at him. That's actually a comment rather than a question, but do you want to comment on that, Sue?
Well, just thank you very much, Henrietta. It's not something that I'd actually noticed. I generally do look at the gazes and in which direction they're going. It's not always possible to pinpoint who's looking at whom or vice versa, but I will revisit that and agree that if that's correct, it does seem to support my hypothesis. So just thank you. I value that.
Yes, that's
observation.
That's useful. Yeah, thank you. Okay, another one for Sue from Caroline Archer. Sue, an excellent talk. Apologies if you mentioned this in your talk, but how did you come across Janos, I can't say it, Thuróczy or something, Chronica Hungarorum? Were you looking for evidence of source inspiration for St. George and turned to the volume, or did you fortuitously stumble across it by chance? Well, that's a key question, isn't it? Okay.
I've got to come clean now because I can't claim credit for having put the two images together. And it's quite a sweet little story. Those of you who've had involvement with BCU for any number of years may remember my late husband, who was Professor of Art and Design History at BCU. He tutored me through my career, if you like, and after my PhD popped the question and we got married and we collaborated on things. Sadly, he died within a few years, and in 2011 left me with his study to sort out and clear, amongst which effects were a folder of images related to Santa Maria, the Madonna of the Vittoria. And he'd ordered from the slide librarian at BCU what looked like a random collection of photographs, which he clearly intended to do something with, but I really had no idea what. So there was the altarpiece, of course. He'd had photographs made of the two Janos Hunyadi images from the Chronica Hungarorum. The engraving of the Battle of Fornovo, which Henrietta has also commented on later in the questions, and many, many other images which he'd had made into very smart black and white photographs. So I was left with the puzzle of what was George going to do with all these? What did they mean to each other and how did they relate? And so that was the serendipity of the photograph of Santa Maria della Vittoria, more or less alongside the images of Janos Hunyadi. And I've really been trying to piece together George's thought processes, because George was brilliant at dreaming up imaginative research projects, but he tended to get a bit fed up of them, no disrespect to George, and some of them just were left and never concluded, and that was one of them. So I've tried and work out what he might have been aiming at, possibly incorrectly, but here we are. I've got a hypothesis, so I'd like to put it out there and just feel my way as to how others respond to it. So yeah. That's it, Caroline. It's not my observation, it's George's.
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis, and we look forward to further discussion of that one. Thank you, Sue. I haven't got any questions yet for Johanna, so come on, do your stuff and give us some questions for Johanna. I've got one for her actually, which I shall. I always have a few questions in reserve in case this happens, because we can't have all the questions for one speaker and none for the other. Johanna, you mentioned the black and white illustration method that you mentioned. Did they learn this purely as drawing, or did they learn how to print those illustrations as well? If so, what methods did they use? Do you know?
I don't think they had printing press, but I think, yes, they learned about printing. And it had always been a tradition at the FSA, even before they went independent in 1860, that students would draw proofs from the output that they produced after, whether it was engraving or wood engraving or whatever. So they did understand what the printer would do with their artwork.
Right, so they just produced the artwork and somebody else
Yes.
printed it. Yeah, good, thank you. Right, let's have, where are we? Let's have another one for Sue. Where have we got to? Oh, Henrietta Lockhart comments again. Also in the engraving of the battle, there was a dragon slain in the bottom right corner. Is a direct link being made in that engraving between Gonzaga and St. George? Although could it be excuse me, St. Michael as well, since he was also a dragon slayer? There's a lot of dragons being slain. We can't claim nobody was harmed in the making of this presentation. A few dragons bit the dust by the look of it. So.
Yes, that's interesting. I hadn't seen the dragon as having been slayed, actually. So I've had another quick look back at it, and it looks rather to me that the dragon is alive and looking into a strange creature in a burrow. But I mean, it's a good point, because as I was saying to Caroline, in answer to Caroline's question, this arose from this motley collection of images that were left to me by my late husband, and that engraving was one of them. And I'm not entirely sure, you've hit a weak point here, because I'm not entirely sure whether that engraving is claiming the victors to be the Gonzaga or the French. I came down on the side of it claiming a Gonzaga victory, but if the dragon is slain, it might be that this was an engraving that was made to support the French argument for having been victors. So it's valuable that this is brought up. It forces me to look more closely with my magnifying glass at the engraving. So thank you, Henrietta. I'll have another look at that.
Excellent. There's more questions coming now. Let's find one for Johanna. Yes, here's one. In fact, there are several now since I prompted them. They're coming in thick and fast. Well, it's about 3 actually. I'm exaggerating. Erica Lederman says, hello, Johanna. Thank you for a great talk. Interesting to note that the original pointer drawings transferred onto tiles by the FSA students were photographed by a female photographer, Isabel Agnes Cooper, who became the official museum photographer at the South Kensington Museum. These photographs were probably made as aids for the students. While Cooper was not a student at the FSA, her father, the well-known engraver John Thompson, was a teacher there. Again, a statement rather than a question, but do you want to comment on that, Johanna?
No, Eric and I have discussed the various connections between our lines of inquiry.
Right, so nothing to add on that one. Let me get back up and find one. Oh, sorry, I have to go through all these. Wait a minute, let's find another one for Sue. Well, so this is a general comment. I think it's intended for both speakers, from Teresa. Lovely to see all of this, a different perspective on history, and much better, I think, than always studying kings, prime ministers, and battles. Thank you. Yes, I echo that. And someone called Chris Bloomer says that they have lots of questions for Johanna, but I don't think they've asked one yet. So please type your question, Chris. Anonymous attendee. Oh, Johanna again. You mentioned that graduates found their way overseas. Do you know where they went?
All sorts of places, but mostly urban centres. Obviously, Britain was an imperial force at the time, and a lot of people went to the members of empire, India, to New Zealand and Australia. Some of them actually recommended to teaching posts in India and New Zealand. And there were a lot of family connections as well between people who'd emigrated, or women who'd emigrated, and their families back here who were then students and who then emigrated. USA, Canada, all sorts of places.
All around the globe. That's good. Thank you. We had that one. No, we haven't. Sue again. Some Sophie Alex Capdeville. I've tried to find information on St. George the conqueror, the Orthodox saint, which seems to be important in Hungary. Would it be relevant to look at his icons remaining in Hungary? I'm not sure if that is an important point. It's only a suggestion.
Well, it's certainly something that I haven't done so far. So that is indeed a new cache of images that I can turn to see how they're relevant. So thank you for that. Yeah.
A research trip to Hungary maybe in the offing. Okay, done that one. Johanna, Laura Vasovic asks, have you been able to find out whether these women illustrators created illustrations for the periodical press or for literary annuals?
Well, depends on the period. Certainly for the, I think one wouldn't call them periodical press, one would call them magazines. In the 80s and 90s, yes, they did. And particularly, of course, for those which concerned themselves with what women were supposed to be interested in, which was domestic life and fashion. And they did a lot of that. And I think that they also created, certainly those who trained at the RA and became exhibiting painters, did illustration work for books for publishers. But it was still very prevalent, the view that women were generally only asked to illustrate children's books or books for women or young girls which were of a sentimental nature, which is one of the reasons why the black and white illustration was so revolutionary, because it was a much more dynamic form of illustration than, I mean, it was used for court reporting and for, as it is now, for all sorts of purposes which were not traditionally feminine.
Right, we can follow that one up with another question from, or a question from Chris Bloomer about black and white illustration. Can you explain whether the FSA was placing students in wood engraving workshops or as autonomous artists working in Thomas Bewick's tradition?
No.
No.
I mean, I think probably my previous talk for HoPIN was looking at this. I mean, wood engraving by this time was a low value piece of work. And it was virtually impossible to make a viable living at it unless you were very, very well supplied with work to do every day, long days, health destroyed, and you have very good contacts in particularly the daily press, who obviously paid a premium for material which was to be printed the next day. And it was not work which, well, firstly, women found it very difficult to actually get into that network of fast-moving commissions, but also many of the Thomas Bewick tradition, or the inheritors of Thomas Bewick's tradition, had set up workshops with huge numbers of apprentices, who then went on to found their own semi-formal workshops. And it was very male dominated. And I think one of the reasons which, in fact, is an interesting observation in one of the Society for the Promotion of Employment for Women reports in about the 1882 or 3, perhaps, a little bit earlier maybe, that it just wasn't worth thinking about for a woman going into wood engraving, and they didn't promote apprenticeships in this, and certainly the FSA didn't either.
No. Okay, thank you very much. I've got another one for you, Johanna, from Kate. Not a question, but an anecdotal answer to your question about whether every young woman who took a class, taught or administrated, left with at least a seed, in inverted commas, planted. That, in my mind, no doubt led to later progress of women artists. Something as simple as a mother mentioning a class experience to a daughter would in that time, would be in that time provocative. That sounds like a fair comment, do you think?
Absolutely, yes. And
Yeah.
the work that I did on the 1850s generation showed family relationships developing in the female line through to women who were themselves teachers in the schools of design, even as far-flung as New Zealand, as I mentioned, who had obviously been encouraged in their early days to pick up a pencil by an aunt or a mother or whatever, who herself drew on her experience informally of the rigors of the South Kensington method.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much. We've got a few minutes left. Nearly, not quite 10 minutes, but getting on. So let's at least 5 minutes. If you have further questions, I've got a couple more. I'm short of ones for Sue now, so if you've got questions for Sue, let's have them. Another one for, I've got 2 more for Johanna. Chris Bloomel asks, can you explain what might have caused the FSA to move so often? How did its diverse locations change its mission or its ability to help women as professional artists? It did move quite a lot, a bit like the Bauhaus in a later period. It moved around, but that was for different reasons, I know. But did it have a particular reason for moving, or was it just?
It moved 4 times in the first 20 years, and then it stayed put at Queen Square. But the reason it moved in between 1842 and 1860 was, well, they were mostly down to the needs for space and the availability of accommodation, which was necessary for the male students, first at Somerset House, and then at Marlborough House, and then at South Kensington. So I think that it was the whole government schools of design was a new organisation from 1838, and they moved around in grace and favour government buildings until Henry Cole really set the thing on the map at South Kensington, and the FSA moved in parallel with them from less salubrious to slightly better accommodation. But Queen Square was the accommodation at Gower Street was the reason that Henry Cole found to try to close them down, because the government was paying the rent on Gower Street, which it didn't do for any other school of design. They were all expected to be independent of government in this regards premises after an initial setting up grant. And he found that he was, as I'm sure everybody knows, he liked things to be consistent, and he felt that the FSA was an anomaly which he could do without in his grand design. And it was therefore thrust upon Louisa Gann that she had to find a new management committee, find new premises, get new setup, find new financing. And in 1860, when he told her that they would no longer pay the rent on Gower Street after Labor Day in the summer of 60.
Were all their locations in the same sort of area of London? I recognise some of them. Are they all Bloomsbury, Tottenham Court Road-ish?
Yes, I mean, they were all very much, I mean, London between, say, 1830 and about, until the migration westwards to Kensington started, amongst the, I suppose, late pre-Raphaelites. The whole area between the Strand and Tottenham Court Road was artists. Here be artists. everything to do with artists. Greater and lesser. And of course, many other sort of semi-luxury trades and hats and things servicing the posh elite.
That would be a good title for another talk or an article, wouldn't it? Here be artists. Sue, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm really wondering about the motivation of the student cohort at the FSA. Is it possible to know to what extent it was they were motivated to study for personal enjoyment, personal fulfillment, to make a political point because they wanted to earn money? And slightly connected to that, if they were married, any income that they derived was actually deemed to be the husband's property until I think it was 1907. So do we know what proportion of the student cohort were married or single, or over to you? What do you know?
So what I know is that it's impossible to generalize, but that the majority of women who, and I mean, these are not student-aged people as we understand them to be now. So these are not necessarily 18, 19, 20-year-olds or girls. They are sometimes young women who are being single already for quite a few years as adults. So, you know, typically a girl or a young woman would come to the FSA at maybe 13 if she was intending to make a living in one of the art trades. She might be finished with the elementary classes maybe 6 years later. Now, that would very much depend on whether she and her family could afford for her not to be earning any money during that time. And of course, a vast number, they had to leave in order to find work. And one of the principles of the FSA, that one of the most difficult things they had to tackle in the 60s and 70s was to try to bring that cohort into more advanced study through using scholarships and persuading them that it was worth continuing their studies because they would ultimately be in a better position to earn. So that cohort, I think, were very much focused on learning what they could in order to get a job. I mean, I use the word job loosely because of course nobody had jobs like we know them now. No. They were, almost everybody was paid a day rate or a commission rate, and that was a very precarious position to be in. But at least if you worked for some sort of a company or a business, then somebody in that business was getting more business to come in, so that you had a throughput of work which you didn't have to individually rake together. Then, of course, there were a number of students who fancied that who had maybe been privately educated and had had art classes and wanted to take painting courses, and thought that if they went to the FSA, then they could put together a portfolio which would then enable them to move on to the Slade or to the Royal Academy or to South Kensington. And some of them did. So those are the two extremes, really, of a wide spectrum of motivation. I think that most women that I've been able to trace, and that, of course, is partly a feature of the way that, I mean, I traced them through the census, and through, if they were exhibiting artists, of course, one can correlate census records to exhibition catalogues so that you can verify from addresses and relations who they are. But very few marry. And of course, that's a feature of census, because unless you're so fortunate as to find the marriage record, after their marriage, you've lost them.
Yeah, very true.
So it's very difficult to know, but a large number remain single.
Yeah.
And many of them, of course, also found, coming back to your point about property, that in order to be economically viable, they needed to form households or workshops with other practitioners who were also female. And consequently, that really enabled them to keep their earnings and to pool their earnings as if they were a family household of a craft worker's kind.
Yeah, That's interesting. Okay, thanks very much. We're pretty much out of time, so I've got one last question for Johanna. Could you answer it really briefly, please? It's from Sarah Castagnetti. Johanna, have you used copyright records from Stationers Hall in your research at all?
No.
No, that was a short answer. That's a nice short answer at this stage of the proceedings. Thank you. Okay, well, I need to wind it up now then, and to thank both speakers very much again for two excellent talks. I think they were both exceptionally good. Thank you, Laura. Talking rubbish. Thank you, Johanna and Sue. Next, I want to thank Laura, who's been doing the technical stuff behind the scenes. Thank you very much. From University of Wolverhampton, who are our supporters and helpers in these things. And Claire, who couldn't be with us tonight, but is in charge of the events team at University of Wolverhampton. The next one of these is on the 17th of March. I can't tell you the speaker or subjects yet because it hasn't been arranged. It will be very shortly. If you want to find out, join HoPIN, and then you will get the very occasional newsletters and emails. You won't be inundated by any means. One final thing is that on YouTube, you will find videos of previous events. This event has been recorded. There'll be a video on YouTube probably in the next couple of weeks. So if you want to watch it all again or tell your friends or whatever, you'll find it on YouTube, and we'll put links to that in the next HoPIN emails. So thank you all very much. Thank you those who asked questions. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you again to University of Wolverhampton. Laura, do you want to say anything before we go?
No, nothing at all. Just to let you know, obviously, that it will be available in terms of recording on our website, and we'll be able to share sort of any other questions that you've got. Please don't hesitate to email Wolverhampton University. We'll be able to pass those on to the speakers. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer any questions outside of the webinar as well. That's it from me.
Great. Thank you all very much. That's it. Thank you.